Dear followers of De Wereld Morgen, for non-Dutch speakers, that means the world tomorrow. We are a website that are concerned with the world tomorrow for our kids, grandchildren, and our grandchildren, and so on. We try to give a voice to the social struggle in our own country, Belgium, and in Europe and abroad. And also, we also want to talk about what's going on in the world on the climate and on the issues of peace and war. And more specifically, that is our subject of our honored guest tonight. Tonight we are talking to Anne Wright, that's right with a W in front. She has a background in the military, but she is much more able to explain that to us. Anne, please, can you give us a little background on yourself?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm all the way halfway around the world as you talk about issues in the world. I'm halfway around living in the islands, the sovereign islands of Hawaii that were a coup was made 125 years ago on the Kingdom of Hawaii, and the state was annexed by the United States in 1959, but it is still a very Hawaiian sovereignty is an issue that we have right here, where we have the militarization of these islands. But to my background, I was in the U.S. military, in the U.S. Army for 29 years. I retired as a colonel. I was also a U.S. diplomat for 16 years and served in U.S. embassies in Nicaragua, Grenada, Somalia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Sierra Leone, Micronesia. I helped reopen the U.S. Embassy in Afghanistan in December of 2001, and then went on to what turned out to be my final assignment, which was as the Deputy Ambassador at the U.S. Embassy in Mongolia. And it was there in March of 2003, 20 years ago, that I resigned from the U.S. government in opposition to the U.S. war on Iraq. And since then, I've been active with peace organizations in the United States and around the world. And that's how I came to know you in Brussels in July of this year at the Global Women for Peace Say No to NATO and No to NATO events in Brussels, Belgium.
Well, actually, and I can, because you say you live so far away on the other side, we do live on the same planet. That's always important to say, on the same little globe. There's a little word in what you said that already points out what your opinion are. You said the war on Iraq. You did not say the war in Iraq. Big difference. Now, could you comment on us? It has to do with the reasons why you left the military. How do you stand towards the United States government, its wars now, and now the involvement on the war in Ukraine? I saw recently an article that says that even in the US, about 51%, according to an opinion poll, do oppose further military support to the war in Ukraine, which is astounding since what they read in the mainstream media, especially there, is the total opposite. Or am I mistaken?
No, I think you're right. There is a change in the views of the American public. First, I would say my role in the last 20 years has been to challenge U.S. government policies on war and other issues on privacy, on on a variety of issues. And in fact, in my letter of resignation, in March of 2003, I listed that not only the war on Iraq, but the unnecessary curtailment of civil liberties during the, after 9/11 with the Patriot Act, the unbalanced policies of the United States on Israel-Palestine, and the lack of effort of following up on the Clinton administration's work in trying to stop a nuclear program in North Korea by providing, providing a heavy fuel electric production plant. So there were a lot of issues, even when I resigned, that I said I was going to work on. Little did I know, I was going to be working on so many different issues around the world. And certainly the wars of the United States and of other countries. And this one, as you mentioned, of Ukraine, I totally oppose the Russian invasion on Ukraine, but I will put the caveat on that the U.S. and NATO had plenty of warning on what was going to happen. The Russian Federation had been telling the United States and NATO for decades that that bringing Ukraine into NATO was a red line, and U.S. ambassadors to Russia had reported on this. And then with the buildup of over 100,000 military Russian forces on the border of Ukraine prior to the November or the February invasion by the Russian Federation, you would have thought that that would have compelled the West to go into honest negotiations with the Russian government on this. There had been the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements, but we find out later that from the German Chancellor Merkel that those were just agreements to buy time for NATO and the U.S. The U.S. public initially was overwhelmingly supportive of the Ukrainian. I mean, any country that gets invaded by any other country has the right to defend itself, for sure, and that's exactly our prediction in the Iraq War when the U.S. invaded Iraq, that there would be local opposition to what the U.S. was doing, no matter how much some groups opposed Saddam Hussein, but they didn't want their country attacked and more operations that we knew were going to be so destructive. And the same for the U.S. public on Ukraine, that they have the right to defend themselves. But the position that we have as peace activists is that these wars can go on forever, and we need to get them stopped for the safety and security of the people of Ukraine and the safety of people in Russia and the safety of the whole world, because the escalation of all of this with the U.S. Continuing to pour weaponry and ammunition and missiles and things like that into Ukraine, it raises the specter of a mistake, a decision that may provide even more catastrophic situations for the whole world. So I think that's where we now see that there are fewer people in the United States that are supporting the U.S. continuing to put weapons in. I think the U.S. public still definitely supports the right of the Ukrainians to protect their territory. But whether or not the U.S. and NATO countries are encouraging more war rather than discussions on ceasefires and then some sort of an agreement between the warring parties to stop the killing.
The thing is, of course, that there was almost a peace agreement in March last year, and the US via its I would say its lackey Boris Johnson from the UK blocked it. So there are those voices who say, well, there are power structures in the US who want this war to go on, if not only for the armaments industry, but it's just to weaken Russia as a competitor on the global world scale. Now, when we say that, at the same time, there are voices, especially in the Republican part, as I see, who say, well, the Russia is not the issue. What we needed to do is start a war with China. Now, that is really something that abhors me. What do you think on those tendencies?
Well, they are terrible. The fact that the U.S. government, even during the Obama administration, that's when the pivot to Asia and the Pacific happened. And it was because Obama was drawing down the number of military forces in Iraq. And, in order to keep military funding and the Congress to fund it, then you need to have some sort of an enemy. And so the enemy was determined during the Obama administration, and then continued during the Trump administration, and now with the Biden administration, that China will be our next enemy. And even though now the Biden administration is kind of backing off a little bit, because I think they have now seen that this China as our enemy, and more sanctions being put on China, and more U.S. military ships doing what they call freedom of navigation exercises, which are naval armadas, large numbers of U.S. ships that are going very close to the Chinese mainland, and purposely trying, in my opinion, trying to provoke something, particularly on the issue of Taiwan. Even though the United States for the last 40 years has had what they call a one China policy. Back during the Nixon administration, the U.S. signed a document saying that the People's Republic of China is the one China, and that Taiwan is a republic of the mainland China. Even though, I mean, this is doublespeak, which is the U.S. government is really good at. I mean, it'll talk about one part of a policy on one side of its mouth and then undercut it on the other. Because during this whole 40 years, the United States, while it does not diplomatically recognize Taiwan, it recognizes it in every other way, to include huge commercial interests in the high-tech industry, the computer chip industry. The U.S. sells weapons to Taiwan. In fact, there was a multi-billion-dollar sale just very recently. So that plus, in the last 4 years, starting under the Trump administration, the U.S. has been sending high-level diplomatic and congressional delegations to Taiwan to purposely irritate the PRC, and the PRC responds every time we send a high-level delegation, whether it's Nancy Pelosi when she was Speaker of the House of Representatives, or an Assistant Secretary of State that comes to visit, or now even senior-level military officers. The People's Republic of China responds by sending jets across the Taiwan Strait, and it's only 100 miles across. So by the time these jets take off from their air bases located right on the coast, within 5 minutes they are right at the air defense zone of Taiwan, and then Taiwan has to respond by alerting all of their air defense, all of this stuff. So the possibility of some misstep, some miscalculation, that something happens and the two sides exchange gunfire is very possible. And in fact, we have a new person that is working with us on China and North Korea issues. He's a retired lieutenant general, a 3-star general from the U.S. Air Force. His name is Dan Leaf, and he was the deputy commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, the U.S. military command that covers half of the world. And he has written an article, an essay back in 2019 about needing to change the U.S. ideas of how issues of North Korea should be approached. We found out about him as we were working with Women Across the DMZ, a group of 30 international women that went to North Korea in 2015 to speak to North Korean women about the effects of the Korean War. And then we traveled across the DMZ and went to Seoul, South Korea, to have a conference with 500 women of South Korea on the same subject, how that war from the 1950s, 70 years ago, still affects daily life in South Korea. Well, anyway, Dan Leaf has written an op-ed in the New York Times, and it primarily speaks to North Korea, but he does say the same thing about the miscalculation of U.S. military forces being in the area around China, as it is right on the DMZ in South Korea, is very, very dangerous. And we've seen that these confrontations don't result in anything good, except that more weapons are sold and more of the think tanks around the world that have hundreds of writers and speakers on the status quo of keeping up confrontation rather than cooperation and dialogue. So we are pleased that Lieutenant General Dan Leaf, as a senior military retired officer, is speaking up. I, as a retired colonel, have been speaking up for 2 decades. It's great to have more senior forces join our peace movement.
Well, actually, you mentioned there the whole thing that's going on in the Taiwan Strait. What appalls me all the time is when a man like Secretary of State Blinken is giving a press conference that there are hardly any journalists stating the obvious questions. When he says what we need is a world based on a rule-based order, that not one journalist raises, excuse me, isn't the US one of the countries that refused to sign the United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Seas, which is the main general order in the world? And this brings me to another thing, how the mainstream media in the US, when actually this is what we do also here, criticize our own media because it's more or less the same problem, how they only give one side. And well, actually, I'm not saying they are forced to, but they do function in practice as a propaganda outlet for the US government. I'm sad to say, but is that something that you might disagree with?
No, I don't disagree at all. I think it's absolutely accurate. Every now and then you get a reporter that will do investigative reporting, and the mainstream media is kind of forced to challenge the U.S. government policies. The Pentagon Papers from 50 years ago is a good example of that, where mainstream media, the New York Times, Washington Post, all of those were really forced into finally publishing these things, even though they had them for several years, but they were afraid to publish them with the Nixon administration going after anybody that challenged the U.S. war on Vietnam. And I think we have the same problem right now, that we don't have independent media, that it is beholding to the U.S. government, or feels like it is. So the investigative outlets are very small. We have The Intercept, we have Democracy Now! We do have some, and they do a valiant job in trying to make sure that we, the public, have alternative news that the mainstream is not picking up at all. So it's very important that we encourage and financially donate to them, because right now the mainstream media is participating in a McCarthy-like campaign against people of peace. In the last 6 weeks, we have had 4 major media outlets that have maligned and libeled members of our peace community, including myself. But we've, in Newsweek and the Wall Street Journal, in the New York Times and the Honolulu Star-Advertiser, we have now had those media publishing libelous, McCarthy-like red baiting articles on members of the peace community, of Code Pink Women for Peace, of Women Across the DMZ. None of these outlets have gotten in touch with any of us that they name in the articles before they publish them. They just go ahead and publish them. So, you know, it's outrageous, because once these things start getting on the internet, then it blows up. And the very important work that we do as challenging our government's war policies is being undercut by the media, essentially calling us propaganda tools of the North Koreans or the Chinese or the Iranians or whatever, when all we're trying to do is to actually go to these countries, see what the effect of policies are, and report that in every one of those countries that I've mentioned, and let's just put Cuba on that one also, that you don't find any people in those countries that say, yes, we'd love to have war with the United States. We would love to take the US down. Never, 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 because of course they recognize for sure that if there is a war with the United States, that they are going to get pounded. And we should recognize that we're going to get pounded too, because it's, you know, it's one thing to pick on Iraq, even though the US used the rationale that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, even though they knew they didn't. But we do know that North Korea, China have weapons of mass destruction. The Iranians, well, the one good thing about, well, several good things about the Obama administration, but they did try and succeeded in getting an agreement on the issue of nuclear weapons, but the Trump administration threw it out. And then poor old Cuba, that has been the whipping person of the United States, you know, 90 miles off the shore of the US, and no threat to the United States at all in any way, still suffers under 60 years of horrific, horrific sanctions. So that are providing that a lot of Cuban people feel that they need to leave Cuba because it's more difficult to live there because of the sanctions US has.
Well, I can tell you that these insults that are that we get here with our little media here in Belgium is also your Putin lovers and whatever. You get your orders from Moscow. And while at the same time we criticize, for example, the mainstream media here and in the US, I always say to people, where do you get all this information from? Well, if I write about the US, I get that information from American media, small media. I'm not writing on the basis of a French analysis of the US. I look those up when I want to speak about France, our neighbor to the south. Because at the same time, I have to say that the alternative, whatever you call them, media in the US are excellent. And actually, I could even say that the US is the birthplace of alternative media long before the internet. That should be emphasized too. Anyway, what you give is an image of peace activism in the US that never gets a voice here too, in the mainstream, that is. So I thank you very much to give that overview and to show people here, listen, it's not like what you see in the mainstream media about Americans, you know, cowboy hat and, you know, saying stupid things. And on the other hand, sensible people in Washington, D.C., as if there's nothing in between. There's a lot of activism in the US, and I'm glad that we can talk to you about it to show it to our people here. Anyway, I would like to use the opportunity as a small extra. You live in Hawaii, in one of the islands, but there's a real disaster going on, almost finished, on another island than the one you live on Maui. Could you, and the articles that I read is that this was actually a disaster waiting to happen. Could you comment a bit on that?
Yes, the great tragedy of wildfire that occurred on the island of Maui that has killed, we don't know how many. Right now, they've identified that they do have 100 and I think 30 bodies. They've only been able to identify maybe 20 of them because of the burning, incineration of the people in their cars, in their homes, on the streets, because of the intensity and the speed that fire moved through the town of Lahaina. And also the small village of Kula, which is up country, 40 miles away from where this other wildfire hit. But yes, it was waiting to happen. And in fact, it had happened before on a smaller scale. In 2018, a wildfire, a brush fire came down and burned 18 homes. The fact that the land that was above the city of Lahaina, up toward the mountains, had been changed from water-based agricultural kalo to more resort area types of use. and taking the water from the indigenous Hawaiians and putting it into the luxury resort reservoirs meant that the grass, the non-indigenous grass, kept growing and growing, and it was a tinderbox because it's very dry over that area, and with the very, very strong winds that came in as a part of a hurricane that went by, all of a sudden a spark, probably from electric lines that were blown down, started igniting fires in the various parts of the city of Lahaina, and within a couple of hours an inferno erupted. What we're dealing with now is not only the recovery of the remains and trying to help the survivors, and the outpouring of donations and actual food products and clothing products has been astounding. In fact, the people on Maui are saying, don't send any more to Maui right now. Hold it where you have it. And when we need it, we will call forward more because they don't have enough warehouse space.
But that's support from ordinary Americans, not from the authorities.
Well, I will say that the government has been very good. The FEMA, the Federal Emergency Group, was there within 12 hours of the fire happening. So there have been a lot of U.S. federal government and local government issues or issued of food and clothing, but the majority of it has been citizens sending it in also, trying to get it out and around the island to where a lot of people, the survivors were, was a combination of Coast Guard as well as citizens who had their own boats, thank goodness. But yeah, there's a strong federal presence here. There are over 700 U.S. military. There are 1,000 of the FEMA that are helping, trying to dig out all of the well, as the remains are searched with cadaver dogs, 40 of them. You know, they're trying to figure out where they're going to put all of this debris and everything. I will say that the issue of disaster capitalism, of people not from Hawaii, but from the continent of the United States and continent of North America and other places, are, you know, there have been attempts to buy up from these people who have lost everything. Let us buy your property. At least you'll have money in your hands. You can go wherever you want to. So the state of Hawaii has put a moratorium on any sort of sales like that, so that and housing mortgages that are now on houses that no longer exist, those have been suspended until the types of loans, interest-free loans to rebuild, can be set up. So, you know, it's been 2 weeks. It's a huge, major, horrific disaster. But the spirit and generosity of the peoples of all the islands of Hawaii and people from around the world has really been quite astounding.
And I have to thank you very much for your contribution. We will publish this shortly. I also thank you, our followers. We offer this information for free, but of course, you're always welcome to support us. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Nice to be with you.